The last type of cybercrime we're going to talk about is cyberterrorism and cyber war. These concepts have been defined different ways depending on who you ask. Susan Brenner, our cyber law expert, defines cyber terror as using computer technology to engage in terrorist activity. It's a pretty direct definition, and it's simply referring to the fact that if individuals use computers to terrorize, that would be cyber terror. Cyber war, in contrast, is according to Brenner, the conduct of military operations by virtual means. Now, significant to note, just as our other types of cybercrime, it was the advent of the internet and the advent of the computer and the advent of that sort of technology that created the setting and the opportunity for cyber terrorism and cyber war to occur. Now, throughout time, we've had terrorism, we've had war, and the methods of terror and the methods of war have changed systematically as the various systems have changed in society. Indeed, we didn't have the atomic bomb until relatively recently. We didn't have guns and those sorts of weapons until the prior century or two, the 1800s. And when we see war changing over time and the methods of war changing over time, it shouldn't be surprising that technological advances have shaped the way that we now see war and terrorism occurring. Now, some authors use the phrase information warfare. Martin Libicki is one of those, and he wrote a book, actually back in the 1990s, he wrote a book called What is Information Warfare? And in there he identified several types of information warfare. And the first type, one type is psychological warfare. And psychological warfare is when people will use information to scare people. Now, when Libicki wrote his book, the internet was not yet a thing. But now, if Libicki were going to look at psychological warfare, he would certainly point to the way that terrorists use the internet and sell propaganda to the public and make people fear certain things or afraid of certain things. And that psychological warfare can be quite damaging, and what it stems from is simply the sharing of information in ways that can be frightening. There's also command and control warfare. This type of warfare would be the examples of when the military targets the infrastructure that is used to share information in a particular government or a particular area. And if the military destroys that infrastructure and destroys that command center, then they effectively limit the distribution of information, and that would be a type of information warfare. Electronic warfare is when the military does things that changes the flow of electrons or information, making it so, imagine we're sending an email, yet there's a form of electronic technology that stops our information from actually making it to its destination and interrupts the flow of those electrons so that they can't get from point A to point B. And that would be electronic warfare if it's done in order or as a part of a wartime effort. Hacker warfare is when we have hackers that are part of this effort to steal information and to misuse information or to introduce viruses or other types of malware. And we talked a little bit about those when we talked about hackers. But there's also economic information warfare. And this is when information is used specifically to harm the economy. Now, it certainly overlaps with other types of warfare, but it can also be identified as a type. And Libicki also talked about cyber warfare. He talked about it as a type of information warfare. Now, given where we are today with the huge evolution in cyber technology, some would prefer to see cyber warfare as its own distinct variety. Now, there's certain patterns that we can talk about with cyber terrorism. Harm is similar to the harm from other crimes, but they're, as Susan Brenner points out, inflicted for very different reasons. They're inflicted for ideas of power and control and to exert influence. And it's more of a systematic or systemic sort of infliction of harm rather than individuals being targeted for more specific motives. The goal is demoralization through cyber technology. So that's much bigger than a specific target that where someone may harm another individual in a particular fraud or a particular scam. And that demoralization through cyber technology exists at a societal level where that whether it's fear or whether it's an economic influence or whatever it may be, it can be somewhat devastating for a society. There's three categories of cyber terrorism. First is the weapon of mass destruction, and this is the idea when computers could be used to harm the critical infrastructure. And there's an awful lot of effort devoted by our governments, state and federal governments, to protect our critical infrastructure because we don't want a foreign enemy to attack the energy system or to attack the transportation system or to attack our airports, critical infrastructure technology and those sorts of things. And the fear is that an errant virus or other form of malware could potentially have devastating results. And that would be one category of cyber terrorism. Perhaps more often, though, is the weapon of mass distraction. And this is similar to the psychological warfare that Lipicki talked about. And here what Brenner's talking about is when a terrorist group would manipulate a population psychologically. When terrorist groups publicize beheadings on the internet, their purpose is to put fear into the rest of us. And that's a weapon of mass distraction. When they share other information about situations where they want to inflict fear, those are weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass disruption, in contrast, undermine a civilian populace's faith in the stability and reliability of the essential infrastructure, according to Brenner. In essence, what these weapons of mass disruption do is they make a population think that a system is compromised when it's not. They sell the population a bill of goods, and they sell fear, and they make people think that a particular infrastructure is not able to protect us, to serve us, to meet our needs. And that disruption, they do it through information, again, propaganda, and it causes people to question the faith and stability of that infrastructure. Our financial system. There are ongoing efforts of enemy governments to make people think that the financial system is potentially unreliable or unstable. And those efforts are part of this weapon of what Brenner would call mass disruption. Who engages in these acts? It's quite simple. Nation states. Nation states have a lot of money. They have the ability to target, and they have the ability and the motives to engage in these activities. It's believed that some of these, when we talk about nation states, the enemy states are those that would be more prone to engage in cyber terrorist activities, and there would also be cyber espionage and cyber the stealing of information and from either the government or specific companies. And the federal government, the military knows which countries have the higher likelihood. China is believed to have a very strong effort underway to steal information, engage in cyber espionage, and Russia as well. Now, but there's also domestic terrorism that happens within a country where particular groups may target their own citizens, and they may the militia groups, for example, and the hate groups and those types of groups. They use the internet and they use other types of technology to promote hate, to promote this attitude and these beliefs that white power is where we should be addressing our focus as a country. And these types of terrorism can be as significant and as consequential as nation-state terrorism. Now, when you think about the events in Charlottesville that happened with the group showing up and the young woman being killed by the person driving their car down the street, there was certainly a cyber element there. When the white power group showed up, they got there because this information was communicated through the cyber arena and through the internet, and that's how people knew about it. That was domestic terrorism. Now, who responds to it? The U.S. Air Force. Their mission is to fly, fight, and win in air, space, and cyberspace. It was recently changed, their mission, to include this focus on cyberspace because it's recognized that in the past, war and terrorism occurred in air and in space. But now, the Air Force recognizes it also happens in cyberspace. Why do people do these things? There's political motives to gain power. There's economic changes that they want to promote. There's social changes. Gordon and Ford talk about these aspects, and that the social changes are the beliefs that certain groups aren't adhering to their values, and that they want their values to the white power group, for example, or those efforts to expand the focus on those types of beliefs, or other types of terrorists want to promote social changes that would change our society from how we know it is today. The appeal of cyber terrorism, it's cheaper than other forms of terrorism, Wyman points out. You don't need to have a sophisticated laboratory to create a biomedical instrument that could harm people or to create a bomb. It's cheap. It's anonymous. It's in addition to being anonymous, they can target a large number of individuals or a large number of targets. So if we can attack an economy or an infrastructure or whatever it may be, there's a large number of victims. They also can implicate or instigate remote capabilities from across the world. So one country could attack another country, or one group of terrorists could attack without even leaving their country. They do it simply through the internet and are able to cross these international borders. And also the media coverage. They get a lot of attention out of these acts of cyber terrorism, and that media coverage helps to promote the appeal for those who are engaging in these acts. How do these disciplines view cyber terror? Quite simply, information technology would be concerned about how to use information and data in a way that protects rather than harms individuals. Businesses would want to protect against being victims of cyber espionage. Philosophers would question the wisdom of whether information being stored in a certain place, the way that we store information, the way we use information, and whether we've actually created targets for ourselves for victimization in the way that we rely on information. Engineers would be interested in the critical infrastructure and how we can protect the critical infrastructure from attacks by foreign or domestic terrorists. Computer scientists would be interested in how the malware and software and those sorts of things have been used to perpetrate war, to perpetrate harm, and how we might limit those. Criminal justice scholars would be interested in exploring how the police and the courts are involved in cyber terror, and what our constitutional rights are when it comes to the internet and the protections of if a government's concerned that we're engaging in terroristic activities. What are individuals' rights to protect against those? Again, certainly this is an interdisciplinary issue.